announced in the call you received from Rista, I suppose. Tonight's topic is queer studies. I think that queer theory. I think that we spoke a bit about it yesterday. I am assuming it will be more focused on precisely queer theory as such. It will be more narrow. So I introduced Michael yesterday. Most of you are familiar with his work, so let's just give the floor to Michael.
Okay, thank you, Katerina. Thank you all for coming again. As Katerina said, tonight's lecture is on queer theory, particularly on its relationship to speculative realism. And since I assume not everyone is familiar with speculative realism, would that be right? I'm going to give a very brief overview or sketch of this really quite recently emergent current in philosophy, although it's almost 10 years old. It's not that recent. Speculative realism describes the work of a very disparate group of scholars, but four in particular: Quentin Meillassoux, Ray Brassier, Ian Hamilton Grant, Graham Harman, two of which have been here before, to speak. And what they set out to do is to reanimate some of the most radical philosophical problematics of our time through a fresh reappropriation of the philosophical tradition and through an openness to philosophies outside. However, speculative realism is generally considered to be a useful umbrella term, chosen precisely because it's vague enough to encompass a variety of fundamentally heterogeneous philosophical research programs. A bit like queer is an umbrella term in itself, for a variety of different theoretical and sexual positions. These philosophies, while at once radically different from one another, could be said to find some coherence in their opposition to what is called correlationist philosophies. Now, according to Ray Brassier, the only thing that unites the four original speculative realists is an antipathy to what Quentin Meillassoux calls correlationism, which is the doctrine, especially prevalent among continental philosophers, that humans and world cannot be conceived in isolation from one another. A correlationist is any philosopher who insists that the human world correlate is philosophy's sole legitimate concern. The Wikipedia entry for speculative realism is actually quite useful, and it offers some further shared ground between this quartet. It says, while often in disagreement over basic philosophical issues, the speculative realist thinkers have a shared resistance to philosophies of human finitude, inspired by the tradition of Immanuel Kant. What unites the four core members of the movement is an attempt to overcome both correlationism as well as philosophies of access. In After Finitude, Meillassoux defines correlationism as the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. Philosophies of access are any of those philosophies which privilege the human being over other entities. Both ideas represent forms of anthropocentrism. All four of the core thinkers within speculative realism work to overturn these forms of philosophy which privilege the human being, favouring distinct forms of realism against the dominant forms of idealism in much of contemporary philosophy. This is the main premise behind the new realisms, which Katerina has been organising. Lots of talks and indeed a summer school this year. I'm going to go on to argue that much feminist and queer theory is non-correlationist rather than guilty of correlationism, and also non-anthropocentric, and therefore that it resonates in important ways with the concerns of the speculative realists. Now, as I already said, speculative realism is better understood as a plurality of positions covering the widest possible spectrum of thought. And here are just a few: continental realism, accelerationism, post-continental thought, weird fiction, object oriented ontology, posthumanism, new materialisms, transcendental materialism, actor network theory, non-philosophy, eliminativism, dark vitalism, assemblage theory, black metal theory, process philosophy, transcendental nihilism, xenophenomenology, and the list could actually go on. So it's quite a broad term. And in the time I have here tonight, I can only gesture really at the vibrations and connections between queer theory and some of this very long list of new realist positions. Okay, so just to recap a little, it emerged on the critical landscape in 2006, Speculative Realism, and it has rather ambitiously charged itself with the urgent task of renewing or reinvigorating contemporary philosophical thought and challenging the reigning anthropocentrism and correlationism associated with the guilty parties would be postmodernism, deconstruction, post-structuralism, any of the isms or the post-isms. Now it doesn't leave any of those things behind, trailing in its wake. It just calls them out on their perceived anthropocentrism and correlationism. Now one can immediately see the attraction for queer theorists who have been keen from the very beginning, and feminists, to take on the twin terrors of anthropocentrism and correlationism. And one can immediately name certain figures such as Donna Haraway, Elizabeth Gross, Karen Barad, Vicky Kirby, Claire Colebrook, Judith Butler, and they're all exemplary of this critique of anthropocentrism and correlationism. But because their work has largely been perceived as being inextricably tethered to the linguistic, to language, linguisticism, that's largely stymied or put paid to any conversation between feminists and speculative realism up to quite recently. The four very different major figures associated with speculative realism are, as I said, Graham Harman. He is a sort of post-Heideggerian theory of objects. Quentin Meillassoux, who coined the term correlationism in his book After Finitude. Ray Brassier, who's an eliminative materialist. And he's quite attractive to certain queer theorists who are interested in sort of nihilistic positions, sort of post-reproductive futurism, or theories of extinction, for example. And then the fourth would be Ian Hamilton Grant, and he's a nature philosopher who's largely steeped in the German idealist tradition. Now, one of the major criticisms of speculative realism up to now and of its key forward thinkers has been its masculinism and its inattention to feminist work, which largely paved the way for the development of continental realism of various stripes. And Katerina and I are actually working on a book on this very problem. Now, one thing I would say to be careful about is that the critique of these four figures under the rubric of masculinism is potentially dangerous, because what is being referred to as a citational practice, okay, or an inattention to feminism. So it's quite different to call someone a masculist as opposed to saying, well, you could have cited Butler, Colebrook, Barad, etc. Okay, so I think that if one is critiquing, one needs to be careful about the language one uses. And largely the feminist thinkers who have been critiquing speculative realism have not been careful about that. But let's look and see if they have addressed it. Graham Harman has tried to address feminist thinking here and there on his much-read blog, Object Oriented Ontology, but he admits his lack of expertise in the area, although he has written on Karen Barad's Gentle Realism, and he's also written on Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, and a lot of the reportage about the feminist interest in speculative realism comes from Harman's blog, but he says he's not competent to address those kinds of issues, and that seems to me fair enough. Meillassoux, on the other hand, is a little bit trickier. There's an interview with him in a book which Rick Delphine and Iris van der Toon co-edited on the new realisms and the new materialisms. And they asked Meillassoux several questions. Almost every question is about gender or sexual difference, and he answers by evading. He just talks about something else, anything but gender or sexual difference. So I think that's quite interesting. Even though there's lots in his work which is potentially useful for conversations to do with feminism, gender and sexuality. Ian Hamilton Grant doesn't address gender directly, although I'll go on to say in a little while how I think he's quite useful too. And Brassier very, very rarely talks about gender, even though psychoanalysis, particularly Bataille, Lyotard and Deleuze and Guattari's taking up of psychoanalysis, are very important for this idea of extinction and solar catastrophe in his book Nihil Unbound, of which Katerina is a big fan. me not so much. So having surveyed both the four main figures, I think the inattention to feminism is perhaps somewhat valid in the case of the big four of speculative realism. However, the most popular offshoot under this umbrella of speculative realism has been Object Oriented Ontology. And again, there are four main figures associated with what's called triple O, Object Oriented Ontology, triple O. And despite criticisms and the same allegations, Object Oriented Ontology is masculinist, it doesn't cite any feminism, it rides roughshod over the traditions that made it possible. This is actually untrue, because the four main thinkers, or well, at least three of them, Harman is again one of the four, have been paying far more than lip service to feminist and queer thinking. Ian Bogos, for example, wrote a wonderful little book called Object Oriented Feminism, which has been an offshoot of Object Oriented Ontology itself. Timothy Morton, even before Triple O, Timothy Morton wrote a wonderful essay called Queer Ecology, and he has written several essays to do with queer theory, feminism, environmental theory, feminist ecology, and so on. And the last of the four, Levi Bryant, who I'm going to talk about in much more detail shortly, he's written countless essays on feminism and queer theory, and indeed tried to link them to the politics or perceived lack of politics of speculative realism. So I really don't understand the attacks on Object Oriented Ontology. Largely, I would say they are based on rumour, rather than the scholars in question having actually read any Object Oriented Ontology. And this is the danger when a philosophical movement happens largely online or in the blogosphere. You get sort of ad hominem, knee-jerk reactions, which are based merely on descriptions of what people may have written or said, rather than actually going and reading their work. So I don't think the Object Oriented Ontologists actually do cover over the feminist work which made their interventions possible. In fact, it would be much more true to say that they've contributed to the articulation of, or inter-articulation of feminist and queer critique, while at the same time being critical of speculative realism and Object Oriented Ontology's own blind spots when it comes to gender and feminism. Coming from my own position, I've been attacked constantly. I get emails, tweets, Facebook messages, Facebook campaigns on an almost daily basis, saying because I work on this area, which is not the only thing I work on, that I'm a masculinist. So I think it's important to say that the Object Oriented Ontologists have written about this. They are well aware of the pitfalls of sometimes not citing women and being not citing feminist scholars. But at the same time, it's come to a point now after 8 years where there has been no published feminist or queer response or critique to speculative realism or Object Oriented Ontology, which specifically just critiques it. It's come to a point where I think the Object Oriented Ontologists have done enough, and it's time for the feminists, which is why Katerina and I are working on this particular book together.
Can I ask you a question? Can we ask questions while we talk?
Sure.
When did you publish Girls Welcome?
This essay I wrote called Girl
ago.
Welcome. It's about 4 years
Yeah.
ago. It was in the second issue of a journal called Speculations, which is now on its 5th or 6th issue. So
it's really unjust, I mean, unjustifiable.
Yeah.
These attacks.
Anyway, so that's kind of introduction to Object Oriented Ontology and Speculative Realism. Now I'm going to talk in this next section about two feminist thinkers, one of whom is associated with Speculative Realism, Jane Bennett, And then the other, Judith Butler, who mostly isn't seen as of any interest to speculative realists because of what I mentioned, which is that her work is too caught up with the linguistic language and so on to have anything to say to these realist positions, which Katerina's book, The Cut of the Real, I urge you all to read that because her chapter on Butler is advancing a position on her work which argues that Butler is nothing but a realist and has always been. So everything I have to say about Judith Butler is in dialogue with Katerina, and I'm very grateful to her for making possible what I have to say. So I'm going to link up the ideas of some of the major speculative realists with some prominent feminist and queer theorists, not just Butler and Bennett, also Liz Gross, Eve Sedgwick, Leo Brastani, John Halberstam. And I want to tell a rather different story about Judith Butler in this talk. I want to suggest that she has got an ecological or environmental sensitivity to her work. But before that, I just want to say a few words about Leo Brastani and his thoughts on things and his thoughts on things. Brastani, in a sense, has already advanced a sort of non-correlationist or non-anthropocentric queer theory, because when he writes about sexuality and aesthetics, he sees us as having a non-violent relationship to the world, to our external worlds, which wouldn't exterminate difference, or which wouldn't see the masculine, feminine, or human, non-human binaries as something which are intractable or fixed. Rather than doing that, what Brastani does is he argues for an impersonal aesthetic where the subject's need to project himself or herself on the world is not entirely necessary. Brastani says, we correspond to the world in ways that don't necessitate or imply the world's suppression. And he calls this an ontological passivity or an ontological floating, which is just simply letting the world be, which is what Irigaray argues for throughout her work. Just simply letting the world be. So it's a ceaseless receptivity to the world, that ontologically the world cares for us just as we care for the world. Although it's not always the case, as I'll go on to say, that the world cares for us no more than we care for it. Now, Judith Butler's recent work has taken, in my opinion, a similarly ecological turn to Brastani's. She's been extending her idea of precarious life in her attempts to formulate an ethics of global connectedness and mutual co-inhabitation of the world. And I think this will be something of surprise to those who've argued that Butler's book is far too admired in the linguistic turn to have anything to say about objects, or about vibrant matter, or about materialism generally. Another key figure is Eve Sedgwick, whose later writings were especially attuned to and fascinated by textiles, objects, breathing, weather. Because Eve had advanced cancer, she was increasingly unable to write. So she was turning to textiles and her artwork in ways which are really, really interesting for theorists of objects and our relations to objects. For example, the essay The Weather in Proust, which was published after she died, but I was lucky enough to hear a version of it before then. It concludes with these gorgeous lines. It is possible for the universe to be dead and worthless, but if it does not live, neither do the things in it, including oneself and one's contents. So, put it comparatively, the universe itself is as alive as anything it holds. So, there are numerous correspondences, likenesses, coincidences of materials and sympathies between these four theorists, Judith Butler, Jane Bennett, Leo Brastani, Eve Sedgwick, and their ethical and political thought. But I want to focus mostly here on the crossings or attachments between Butler and Bennett. But I want to say something, before I do that, a little bit about the so-called new materialisms. I'm puzzled by the term new materialisms. They're not all that new. I mean, some of these thinkers have been doing it for 20, 30 years. But I want to say something about new materialism. And the links between it and feminism and also political theory. So the new materialist critics' key apprehension is that of the precious matter that all things share. That is, they listen out for the murmurings or susurrations of the world, which is indiscriminately human or non-human. Bennett coins the word thing power to describe or ascribe agency to all things, and she advocates a respect for the object, whose ethical and political value is crucial. I'm going to use a lot of terms which are really unfashionable in contemporary political theory and contemporary queer theory, like respect, dignity, compassion, and even Bennett uses the word sympathy, which would be another relatively underused or disused term. So I want to recuperate terms like that for queer discourse. So Bennett argues that these relationships to other entities, or the thing power that agents have, are protean and non-intersubjective affinities. The reason that they're non, or I would say less, intersubjective is that they're not based on any sort of recognition, which a lot of Butler's early work, because it's inspired by Hegel, is based on recognition. This would be more about kind of affinities or intertwinements or entanglements between masses or materialities. And these massive materialities press their claims on us. And Bennett calls this ethical claim, or these ethical claims, the force of sympathy with things. So we're listening out for, or she's listening out for, the whispering vibrancy of a world, and the goings-on which are incipient in the world, or often underneath it. Michel Serres, a French philosopher who I mentioned yesterday, in a book called Biologia, he similarly argues for a politics of audibility, or inaudibility, and he listens to the widest possible number of languages, the language of flora, fauna, seas, rivers, rats, wolves, mountains, and so on. Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost see the project of critical new materialisms as being the development of a positive ethos of new materialism, which does not exclude critical variants of materialism, seeking to go beyond the cultural turn or constructivism, and to re-engage with more realistic and empirical modes of investigation, the political analysis of actual conditions of existence and their inherent inequality. So they're going back to this age-old problem for feminism and queer theory of essentialism and social constructionism, which we talked a bit about yesterday. Now, new materialist ontologies resist the image of dead or thoroughly instrumentalized or inert matter that simply fuels human hubris and prevents patient attentiveness to non-human forces. So, seeing matter as inert or dead often are seeing the non-incomplete or a strange commonality, as Bennett would say. So the project of new materialism is both critique and demystification. And from the perspective of demystification, Bennett points out that the problem is that new materialism can lead to a restrictive focus on the human, thus presuming and seeking to demonstrate the primacy of human agency that has illicitly been projected onto things. So again, that's just all about us. And that leaves us with nature acting as little more than a cover for human culture and history, which obscures non-human vitality or vital materialism. And this is one of the ways in which Ian Hamilton Grant's speculative realism can be useful to the new materialisms, because they're all heavily dependent on Spinoza and Spinoza's very anti-anthropocentric idea that each entity or each thing can be granted, if you'll pardon the pun on Ian Hamilton Grant's name, a certain agency or power to act or to do. However, having said that, recognising that a certain anthropomorphism is unavoidable even in a political project of vitalist materialism, doggedly resistant to anthropocentrism, new materialisms prefer to place their emphasis on the positive and constructive rather than the critical or the negative. And you'll see this in Karen Barrad's work on quantum physics and feminism, where she is not interested in critique. And Latour, of course, says like critique has run out of steam. They want to make something, they want to compose something, they want to focus on what we can construct rather than what we can destroy. And they see the task as being creating new concepts and images of nature that affirm matter's immanent vitality. As a result, the status of the shared materiality of all things gets elevated into what Levi Bryant has called a radical democracy of things. In his work, Latour calls it a parliament of things, where you can use any term to describe it: democracy, parliament, confederacy, whatever you like, collective. Nigel Clarke's book, In Human Nature, Sociable Life on a Dynamic Planet, proffers a very provocative vision of an inhuman nature which counters the neglect in critical new materialist thought of an inhuman or originary nature. In the new relational materialist work of Bruno Latour, which largely goes under the title of actor network theory, and others who emphasize relationality, there's an emphasis placed on symmetrical or flattened ontologies, in which hierarchies of being are resisted and agency gets equally distributed among interacting entities, human and non-human, animate and inanimate, real and imagined. And when I say real and imagined, that means that fictional characters can also be considered part of the universe of things, or unicorns, for example. This grants to things their constitutive force in social and political life and allows Latour to attend patiently to what he calls the mutual entanglement between nature and human life. Now, Nigel Clarke is concerned that this position gives insufficient attention to the fundamentally asymmetrical relationship between the non-human and the human. And the geographer Doreen Massey also views the implacable otherness, indifference and power of the non-human, and in this she's emphasising, as Clarke is, the vulnerability of human life to non-human forces. And this vulnerability, according to Clarke, imposes on us a primordial passivity in which our constitutive vulnerability to the exorbitant forces of the cosmos must be faced. Now, when they talk about these powerful non-human forces, they mean earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, fire, climate change, which is rapid, and so on. So these powerful non-human forces, they're irreducible aspects of our world, which can lead to what Clarke calls an unworlding blast of a withdrawn ground. Now, for Clarke, the challenges human life must endure on a dynamic planet push at the very limits of conventional conceptions of politics, precisely because they pose the problem of our necessary passivity. He draws on Levinas, Serre, Derrida, Bataille, and he makes these asymmetries, which have been taught to us by the earth sciences, resonate with the insistence in this tradition of an ethico-political embrace of the unilateral, exorbitant, generous and riskily hospitable relations between self and other, precisely in the face of the excess of that human and natural other. So even though these forces, these powerful forces could destroy us, we must be hospitably open to that possibility. And he calls this an abyssal generosity. And if you'll forgive the paradox, this abyssal generosity is actually the ground for justice, or for doing justice. Now, we might compare Butler's being undone in the face of the other to this abyssal generosity. Some of you might know this famous phrase from Undoing Gender, where Butler says, and I love this line, "Let's face it, we are undone by the other, and if we're not, then we're missing something." So there's a sort of call or solicitation that the other makes to us, which we must answer or be responsive to. Jane Bennett also refers to these kinds of calls. In an interview with Klaus Leonhardt, she says, "These vibrant animals, plants, viruses, hurricanes, storms, pharmaceuticals, and other technological artifacts vie with, make demands upon, and impede and enable human agency. They make their presence known to us, or one could say, make calls to which we are continually responding. The ethical task at hand is, I think, to try to describe just what this call is without resorting to the framework of pre-given subjects and objects. So the ethical or political task that falls to us is also to respond without resorting to seeing the call as issuing from the language of humans. In the ecological thought, Timothy Morton thinks ecology as a kind of meshwork, or a coexistence of what he calls strange strangers. And the idea of a strange stranger is just what Judith Butler or Emmanuel Levinas mean by the face of the other, or the figure for alterity. And in Hyper Objects and Realist Magic, two of his more recent books, Morton extends this idea of the mesh of strange strangers to include all objects. This is a long quote from Morton. He says, "What we now see is that non-humans are also filled with infinite inner space. Some of us are ready to grant this inner infinity to certain kinds of sentient being. Some are willing to grant it to all life forms," and this was my position in ecological thought. "And some still further out are willing to grant it to all non-humans whatsoever, no questions asked. These are the object oriented ontologists in whose number I now find myself. I see no inherent reason why what I call the strange stranger in the ecological thought should not apply to any entity whatsoever. Fireplaces, the Oort cloud at the edge of the solar system, flamingos, and slices of pork rotting in a garbage can. Since life forms are made of non-life, and since what counts as a life form is very much a performative act down to the DNA level, I see no big reason not to extend the concept of the strange stranger to cover all entities. The more we know, the more objects, and the more the objectness of objects rise up to meet what and how we know." Emmanuel Levinas's line about cosmic space is appropriate here. "How, when I look at the stars, I realize that I am sought out by inhabitants of the intersidereal spaces." Now, Vicky Kirby has consistently argued, most recently in her book Quantum Anthropologies, that Judith Butler's work is not merely cultural, and that it is not always the case that all that is solid melts into language. Geoffrey Nealon, too, argues for Butler's as a theory that matters, in every sense of the word matters. He says that Butler takes up the notion of matter not as a site or surface, but as a process of materialization that stabilizes over time to produce the effect of boundary, fixity, and surface. Butler argues for the theoretical and political necessity to learn a double movement, to invoke the category and hence provisionally to institute an identity, and at the same time to open the category as a site of permanent political contest. So when Butler uses the word queer, or when she uses the word sexual difference, or indeed when she uses the word matter, she's opening them up as sites of permanent political contestation. They're always open to be renamed, or open to iterability, or to having to be given another name in order to be politically useful. Butler herself, in the essay Merely Cultural, notes this tendency to relegate new social movements to the sphere of the cultural, indeed to dismiss them as being preoccupied with what is called the merely cultural, and then to construe this cultural politics as factionalizing, identitarian, and particularistic. And this has been a charge against Butler's work right from the very beginning. However, as Nealon points out, Butler is always attuned to the importance of contesting matter itself as a sign or as a signifier. Here's a quote from Bodies That Matter, which, if you read it, answers all of Butler's critics straight away. This is the quote. "The relation between culture and nature, presupposed by some models of gender construction, inverted commas, implies a culture or an agency of the social which acts upon a nature which is itself presupposed as a passive surface, outside the social and yet its necessary counterpart. One question that feminists have raised then is whether the discourse which figures the action of construction as a kind of imprinting or imposition is not tacitly masculinist, whereas the figure of the passive surface, awaiting that penetrating act whereby meaning is endowed, is not tacitly or perhaps quite obviously feminine. Is sex to gender as feminine is to masculine? This rethinking of nature also calls into question the model of construction, whereby the social unilaterally acts on the natural and invests it with its parameters and its meanings. Indeed, as much as the radical distinction between sex and gender has been crucial to the de Beauvoirian version of feminism, it has come under criticism in recent years for degrading the natural as that which is before intelligibility, in need of the mark, if not the mar, of the social to signify, to be known, or to acquire value. So that's an exemplary flow of how realist Butler is on instances in Katerina's Chapman Square. So I want to talk now about Butler's ecology, or ecology of the future, and the precarious lives of other non-humans. In Precarious Life, Butler says that vulnerability is something that we all have in common, and she recognises that some bodies are more vulnerable than others, and that any politics or any ethics of corporeal vulnerability must, of necessity, account for the unequal distribution of vulnerability across the globe. Okay. So we're not all equally vulnerable, but we are all vulnerable. So we draw on our own experiences of vulnerability in order to awaken and respond to the suffering of others. And she asserts that we should also reflect on how others are not only as vulnerable as we are, but are even more so. And again, Katerina's work with Laruelle and the figure of the victim and the stranger is highly instructive here. So when talking about unequal distribution of vulnerability across the globe, Butler is concerned, and this is what her critics would say, with human beings who are more vulnerable than other human beings. But it's important to note that there are other embodied lives on this globe that we have made dependent on us, and indeed we are dependent on them, and that these lives are in general far more vulnerable than our own. But again, those lives there's a scale of vulnerability, and it's massively distributed. Here, for example, I'm thinking, just for one example, of non-human animals. So it's quite arresting to read Butler in Precarious Life, and this is a quote from Precarious Life. She says, "Perhaps then it should come as no surprise that I propose to start and to end with the question of the human, as if there were any other way for us to start or end, exclamation mark." It's only one of the most disappointing moments ever of reading Judith Butler, that she says, "I propose to start and end with the human." But I'm going to go on to complicate that assertion. That we must start or end with the human, since Butler always leaves things open, anyway, there is no end. That we must start or end with the human when considering an ethics of corporeal vulnerability is by no means obvious, since corporeal vulnerability does not start or end with the human, but with all those bodies which are consistently and constantly exposed to harm by other bodies. It's what the hashtag All Lives Matter might mean. Given the vulnerable and embodied state of human and non-human alike, it would in fact seem more obvious to start and end with the animal, the mineral, or the vegetable, to begin in fact from non-humans in general, exclamation mark. In Precarious Life, Butler frequently qualifies the word vulnerability with the adjective human, and she does this in her Adorno Prize lecture too, which we'll see in a short while. She always says human vulnerability, and that's a problem. Angela McRobbie reads Butler's arguments regarding precariousness as making our dependency on others the basis for a new politics of mobilising our bodily vulnerability so as to forge connections with others who are daily exposed to such vulnerability. The task is one of responding with humility and generosity to those others with whom we have little or no shared understanding, and the posing of these ethical stances as priorities is to bring into political discussion at this moment in time a radically distinct vocabulary which might be seen by many as profoundly unrealisable. In many ways, this demonstrates the extent to which there has been a near fatal exclusion from public debate in recent years of solidaristic and compassionate values. However, collective life for Bennett, Angela McRobbie and Butler is not simply limited to the agency of humans and or their activities. This is why Bennett introduces the radically distinct term ontosympathy to describe these entanglements. Onto for ontological, or perhaps ontic as well, and sympathy. word for the affinities between us and other entities. I now want to suggest that in texts other than Precarious Life, Butler is not prefixing shared vulnerability with the human. In Undoing Gender, for example, she suggests with a nod to Donna Haraway that livability is dependent upon technology, dependent upon what I have elsewhere called our originary soma technicity. She says there, this is from Undoing Gender, critiques of anthropocentrism have made clear that when we speak about human life, we are indexing a being who is at once human and living, and that the range of living beings exceeds the human. In a way, the term human life, which she has in inverted commas, designates an unwieldy combination, since human does not simply qualify life, but life relates human to what is non-human and living, establishing the human in the midst of this relationality. This paradox makes it imperative to separate the question of a livable life from the status of a human life, since livability pertains to living beings that exceed the human. It's interesting that she says exceed twice there. In addition, we would be foolish to think that life is fully possible without a dependence on technology, which suggests that the human in its animality is dependent on technology to live. In this sense, we are thinking within the frame of the cyborg as we call into question the status of the human and that of livable life. More recently, in her 2011 Nobel Museum lecture in Stockholm, Precarious Life and the Obligations of Cohabitation, Butler says that bonds of solidarity emerge across space and time, and she argues there for a global form of ethical recognition and connection. Drawing on Hannah Arendt, she concedes that the unchosen character of earthly cohabitation is, for Arendt, the condition of our very existence as ethical and political beings. Resulting from this is a crucial insight. She says, the way I read this, every inhabitant who belongs to a community belongs also to the earth, and this implies a commitment not only to every other inhabitant of the earth, but we can surely add to sustaining the earth itself. And with this last proviso, I'd seek to offer an ecological supplement to Arendt's anthropocentrism. So there's Butler herself saying that she's got an ecological argument to make. And this ecological supplement to Arendt suggests that Butler's ontology rests on a bodily nature which is not, as most critiques of her work would suggest and would agree, reducible to human bodies or human bodily life. Indeed, she says, in my view, ethical claims emerge from bodily life itself, a bodily life that is not always unambiguously human. After all, the life that is worth preserving and safeguarding, who should be protected from murder, Levinas, and genocide, Arendt, is connected to and dependent upon non-human life in essential ways. This follows from the idea of the human animal, a different point of departure for thinking about politics. If we try to think in concrete terms what it means to commit ourselves to preserving the life of the other, we are invariably confronted with the bodily conditions of life, and so a commitment not only to the other's corporeal persistence, but all those environmental conditions that make life livable. So the critical shift, I think, that we're witnessing in Butler's thought is from humanism to precarity. And Katerina, you've criticised in quite a few places Butler's humanism in favour of a humanism without the human. But I can see this subtle shift in her work towards precarity. This is from the Nobel lecture too. She says, my point is not to rehabilitate humanism, but rather to struggle for a conception of ethical obligation that is grounded in precarity. No one escapes the precarious dimension of social life. It is, we might say, our common non-foundation, and we cannot understand cohabitation without understanding that a generalised precarity obligates us to oppose genocide and to sustain life on egalitarian terms. Our thinking gets nowhere without the presupposition of the interdependent and sustaining conditions of life. Of course, we must also be sensitive to the ways in which the ties of interdependency and cohabitation can be unsustaining. She says, over and against these instances of cohabitation, there are, as we know, antagonistic ties, wretched bonds, raging and mournful modes of connectedness. So it's not always this charming image of mutual interdependence or mutual connectedness. And Bennett too is more than aware of the sort of countervailing tendencies of having sympathy with things, of this idea of ontosympathy. Because our ties to others can also be what unbind us and lead to aggression and violence, not only against others but against all other humans, but against all others. We often find ourselves, as Timothy Morton laments, in the emergency room of ecological coexistence. Elizabeth Gross responds to this emergency by postulating that since things produce life, it is our responsibility to accommodate things more than they accommodate us, but nevertheless, things are our way of dealing with a world in which we are enmeshed. How we actively make the world is what remakes us in turn, as we render ourselves vulnerable to chaos beyond our control, and chaos beneath the perception with which we carve up the world. So for Gross, the only way to do justice to the world is to recognise that it's not always this charming coexistence, that there are also these destructive ties or mournful ties. And this could be given a positive political spin by reading Quentin Mesu's speculative materialist text on the divine existence, where he talks about the fourth world of justice, which doesn't exist yet, but which may exist in the future, but it should be desired in the present world. And he says that one must actively await acts of justice that display the fervour linked to a belief in the radical requirement of universality, about which I'll say more shortly, and the discovery of the non-absurdity of such a requirement. So Mesu's hope and Butler's hope is, it may be a human hope, but it's a gift of the just made across time, and it's a gift to our tears shed for those who have been lost in the past. So it's a mourning for past losses, but it's also a mourning for future losses which haven't happened yet. So justice belongs to the time, as I said yesterday, of the to come, a time which is of hope and expectation. So previous disasters, miseries, atrocities, early deaths are precisely what motivate this hope for a fourth world or for justice. And it's that irredeemable deaths would have been eliminated from the world, and the universal would cease to designate the requirement of conditions necessary for the blossoming of every life. He also talks about this would lead to the resurrection of bodies, which people have said, oh, it's a crazy idea. But what he really means is the recommencement of a world which would be more just. In her 2012 Adorno Prize lecture, Can One Lead a Good Life in a Bad Life?, Butler's chief biopolitical question is to do with the differential value of life itself. She asks, whose lives matter, whose lives do not matter as lives, are not recognisable as living, or count only ambiguously as alive. In response to this set of questions, she writes that we cannot take for granted that all living humans bear the same status of a subject who is worthy of rights and protections, with freedom and a sense of political belonging. Indeed, there are always what Giorgio Agamben calls homo sacer, bare lives occupying a spectral position, a threshold of indeterminacy between life and death. Those lives which are already considered not lives, or only partially living, or already dead and gone, prior to any explicit abandonment or destruction. Biopolitics or necropolitics exerts powers that differentially dispose lives to precarity as part of a broader management of populations through governmental and non-governmental means. Here I think we might make an argument for what I would like to call bare matter. And this bare matter would be analogous to Agamben's vita nuda or bare life, and to Katerina's idea of the always already broken subject, the broken subject which is exposed constitutively to the vulnerability of all others. And Jane Bennett is all too aware of the repulsive, violent or lethal aspects of our exposure in a vibrant material. So there's also a dark edge to this materialism. There are forces which can eliminate the conditions for human life, eliminate the conditions for livability, so they can recoil back on us. Bennett says there are no cosmic guarantees to be provided by any vital materialism. So the urgent ethical and political question now concerning bare matter is this is from Butler, whose life matters more and whose life matters less? So we need to ask under what conditions it occurs that some lives become unlivable or livable, ungrievable or grievable, damaged or undamaged, disposable, injurable, whose lives or what lives are non-lives, and why those lives in particular. And Butler astutely notes that, of course, this discussion brings us to another question. Are we speaking only about human bodies? And can we speak about bodies at all without the environments, the machines, and the complex systems of social interdependency upon which they rely, all of which form the conditions of their existence and survival? An overarching demand must be precisely for a livable life, that is a life, any life that can be lived. Again, what Butler has to say is absolutely crucial here. She says, how then do we think about a livable life without positing a single or uniform ideal for that life? It is not a matter, in my view, of finding out what the human really is or should be, since it has surely been made plain that humans are animals too, and that their very bodily existence depends upon systems of support that are both human and non-human. So to a certain extent, I followed Donna Haraway in asking us to think about the complex relationalities that constitute bodily life, and to suggest that we do not need any more ideal forms of the human. Rather, we need to understand and attend to the complex set of relations without which we do not exist at all. In the earlier mentioned interview with Jane Bennett, she tells us what this complex set of constitutive relations includes. She says, I experience human agency as the outcome or effect of a certain configuration of human and non-human forces. When humans act, they do not exercise exclusively human powers, but express and engage the agency of a variety of other actants, including food, microorganisms, minerals, artifacts, sounds, bio and other technologies, and so on. The locus of agency is always a non-human or human-non-human collective. So these complex relationalities emerge in an always and ever-evolving configuration. So it's a web or a network or a mosaic of actants or quasi-agents. In an as yet unpublished essay called Proust at the End, which Butler wrote in Mourning for Barbara Johnson and Eve Sedgwick, she's attentive to climate change in ways which might also surprise her critics. The essay begins with this line, a change in weather is sufficient to recreate the world and ourselves. It's a wonderful line, but it's similar to what Gross is saying about the world remaking us in its turn. As with Irigaray, as we know, she emphasises air as that which sustains and ties us in an elemental economy. This is Butler. To breathe requires a conducive world, a world of air, and in this way we are bound to our environments, to shifts in climate, in ways that bear consequences for survival. In her reading of Sedgwick's posthumously published essay, The Weather in Proust, she finds a stress on another modality of desire that seeks rather what is adequate and that forms itself around the very material and ecological conditions of support, sustenance, and persistence. Now, these conditions of support, sustenance, and persistence are, of course, precarious. To go back to her Nobel Museum lecture, she argues there that forms of cohabitation characterised by equality and minimised precarity become the goal to be achieved by any struggle against subjugation and exploitation, but also the goals that start to be achieved in the practices of alliance that assemble across distances to achieve those very goals. We struggle in, from, and against precarity. Thus, it is not from pervasive love for humanity or a pure desire for peace that we strive to live together. We live together because we have no choice. And yet we must struggle to affirm the ultimate value of that unchosen social world. And the struggle makes itself known and felt precisely when we exercise freedom in a way that is necessarily committed to the equal value of lives. We can be alive or dead to the suffering of others. They can be dead or alive to us, depending on how they appear and whether they appear at all. But only when we understand that what happens there also happens here, and that here is already an elsewhere, and necessarily so, that we stand a chance of grasping the difficult and shifting global connections in which we live, which make our lives possible, and sometimes, too often, impossible. Sedgwick too recognises that however unchosen this world may be, we must nevertheless choose. She says there is not only a shifting and remarkable world outside oneself, but one is, in spite of oneself, still open to it, and must be, in order to survive. Bennett calls these global connections enchantments. In her book, The Enchantment of Modern Life, she explains, "The mood I'm calling enchantment involves, in the first instance, a surprising encounter, a meeting with something you did not expect and are not fully prepared to engage. Contained within this surprise state are 1, a pleasurable feeling of being charmed by the novel and as yet unprocessed encounter, and 2, a more unheimlich or uncanny feeling of being disrupted or torn out of one's default sensory, psychic, intellectual disposition. The overall effect is a mood of fullness, plenitude or liveliness, a sense of having one's nerves or circulation or concentration powers turned up or recharged." Nature or environment is, in Sedgwick's essay, personified as giving consent to those who breathe its air and move upon its earth, but its mode of consent is not exactly contractual or legal, and there's no speech act which articulates the mode of giving consent. The world doesn't give consent to us. In an abyssal generosity, then, the environment gives or lends itself, it offers itself to be used, but it trusts that it will survive being used. Bennett too contends that there is a sympathy between enchantment and generosity, or the joy that enhances the prospect of ethical engagement, and that one of the tasks proper to ethics is to enjoy the world. Sedgwick and Bennett's weak ontologies pin their ethical hopes on a feeling of plenitude and generosity. For Bennett, enchantment is a mood or affect circulating between human bodies and the other animal, vegetable and mineral forces they encounter. I associate enchantment with the feeling of being simultaneously fascinated and unnerved in the process of something truly wild and generative. So thing power is always at work in the wild, a term which resonates with the anarchic position of Jack Halberstam, who's often talking about like the wildness of queer theory, sort of punk, anarchic wild. So we might even say that the network of vibrant matter, or the network that it brings about, is what I would like to call an undercommons of things. Or an undercommons of wild things. Okay, so Bennett notes that the word enchant is linked to the French verb to sing, chanter. To enchant is to surround with song or incantation. Now in her co-authored book with Gayatri Spivak, Who Sings the Nation State, Butler asserts that singing is a plural act, an articulation of plurality, and she listens to the sonorous dimension of language. She says language becomes one way of asserting criteria of control over who belongs and who does not. In Butler's theorization of sensate democracy, we discover a politics of audibility or inaudibility, who or what gets heard and who or what does not. Now Butler's work has long argued that unintelligibility leads to a barring of access to the status of the human. Those that lie outside this category are the unintelligible, or what Rancière calls the part of no part. Sam Chambers offers an alternative conception of politics whereby access to the human is not fully given and a livable life is not guaranteed by biology. Sensate democracy means naming the unrepresentable or the uncomprehendable for both Butler and Rancière. So an untimely politics of unrepresentability and inaudibility, that would be a politics for those who cannot be seen or those who cannot be heard, whose lives don't count as lives. That kind of politics of audibility is a necessary one for democracy. And Chambers says, such a politics must refuse the seduction to predict, control or master the future, and it must maintain spaces for rethinking the past. The hope is that such a politics entails the vigilance necessary for democracy to thrive, or even just these days to survive. Actually that's quoting Butler. Butler's materialism might even be, in Quentin Meillassoux terms, a speculative materialism, given that for her the future is always open, it's always hyper-chaotic or super-contingent. Elizabeth Gross shares this understanding of the necessity of contingency. This is from Chaos Territory, art by Gross. She says, the chaotic indeterminacy of the recreation of networks led to planes, zones of cohesion, which do not map this chaos so much as draw strength, force, and material from it, for a provisional and open-ended cohesion, temporary modes of ordering, slowing, and filtering. Now we can glimpse this queer politics of audibility in Levi Bryant's Ontology, which is Bryant's version of Object Oriented Ontology, when he addresses head-on the question of who can speak in his challenge to anthropomorphism. And this is, his ontology is oriented towards the real, a real which is not necessarily something we can grasp or apprehend or access, but which is nonetheless inexhaustible. His realism, which he now calls ontocartography or machine-oriented ontology, is a flattened one, and it's a non-hierarchical approach. He advocates a flat ontology of objects, or a democracy of things, where everything gets included. Levi Bryant, Ian Bogost and Tristan Garcia, and even Harman to some extent, treat all philosophies and ontologies equally, as they do justice to and are attuned to the dignity of objects, to non-life, the undead, bare matter, the animal, or what Katerina calls the non-standard human. Object-oriented ontology creates a further extension of Agamben's bare life, where disenfranchisement, discrimination, and a violent structure of regard and disregard in the politics of life means all life. Now, Tristan Garcia, who's now considered one of the object-oriented ontologists, published a very long treatise called Form and Object just earlier this year in English, translated into English. But he's younger than me, but he's written 10 books already, award-winning novels, and he's a very interesting thinker and writer. But I think he's possibly, although I can't explore it too much here today, the most interesting for queer theorists of the object-oriented ontologists, because his ontology is even flatter than Bryant's or any others, because he calls things, no matter what, all things are equal. His first novel, Hate, is very interesting, because it's set in the time of AIDS activism. It's about complex relationships between characters during the early years of AIDS and the emergence of queer theory and the emergence of a sort of queer and activist politics. So while it's fictional, it's also, I think, quite useful for thinking about a certain moment in queer theory where things were precisely about acting up and causing trouble. In his outlining in the second part of his book, Form and Object, of the concrete emergence of things, he includes gender as a category. And he talks about this binary between naturalism and nominalism, or we would call naturalism essentialism and nominalism social constructionism. And he specifically discusses Judith Butler in that book. He sees essentialism and naturalism and nominalism and constructionism as equally problematic, in that they mirror each other in response to what he calls their strategy of compaction. So in their stead, he puts forward 4 levels. So there's the genetic, then there's the genital, which doesn't necessarily follow on from the genetic. Then there's the difference between man and woman, which doesn't necessarily follow on from their genetic difference or their genital difference. And then finally there's the symbolic difference from the masculine and the feminine, which again doesn't necessarily follow. So all 4 levels are equally real in his ontology, but they don't determine the levels above or below. And that's perhaps in agreement with what I said yesterday about Catherine Malabou, in that deconstruction or constructivism aren't necessarily as free as naturalism is from certain binaries or from certain structures of thinking which are dual. Straight and queer is one such binary which Garcia actually challenges here. He says that all individuals are equal, but certain individuals are more so insofar as they realise and adopt this singularity. They are queer by relation to those who express it in banal, generic fashion. They are straight. So he's making a similar argument to Leo Bersani there, that homoness means anyone can be queer regardless of their orientation. So this queer-straight binary is meaningless. On Garcia's plane, all things are equally something. So it's quite similar to Elizabeth Gross in that he's advancing a realism and a feminist politics at the same time as critiquing social constructionism. So his ontology is not separated from a political concern. Now Bryant rethinks flat ontology or flat thought in terms of Timothy Morton's Strange Stranger, and also in terms of what Harman calls the distinction between real and sensuous properties of objects. Bryant says, where the logical desire underlying metaphysics of presence is predicated on overcoming a loss and thereby attaining presence, The logic of desire underlying object-oriented ontology would emphasize the excess of all substances over their local manifestations. There's always more, and would welcome difference or those eruptions within stable regimes of local manifestation where the strange stranger surprises and indicates this excess. So for Bryant, every entity is a becoming that promises to become otherwise. And this is why entities are not only strange strangers to others, but are strange strangers to themselves, which is what I said about sex differing and differing yesterday. Morton has in his essay Queer Ecology extended his idea of the strange stranger to queer hyper-objects, guaranteeing a theory of withdrawn objects which recognises the strange strangers to everything. So how can we fuse this ontology with a politics, and queer politics in particular? And Levi Bryant, in an essay in, I think it's 2 issues ago, about identities on queer parts and politics, he tries to bring together his ontology, his object ontology, queer theory, a thinking of the event, and Rancière's radical democratic politics. In the partition or distribution of the sensible, queers and women and other minoritarian subjects do not count. They are mute, they have no share, they are the part of no part. But Rancière says because these subjects fall between identities, it's precisely from this non-ontological position or dis-ontological position that they're able to address the wrong in so-called democratic politics. So that's a way of post-politically redistributing the sensible. So those who have been invalidated or rendered mute by the political order or the dominant order, so that would be women, queers, animals, immigrant workers, and so on, they erupt polemically and then have their speech validated or at least heard. So that those who have been previously invisible, silent or unknowable are then able to talk, be seen, known. So this radically democratic politics facilitates the eruption of valid political subjects who are able to take up their share in the distribution of the sensible, however impossible their identity and speech may be. However, Levi Bryant is quick to point out that the political subject for Rancière is always the human subject. Man is a literary animal, and it seems for Rancière that only humans are capable of speech. Yet an engagement between Rancière's political thought and Bryant's non-anthropocentric philosophy reveals an altogether different distribution of the sensible, of what parts get to count in large-scale objects. So it's clear then why he's moved from object-oriented ontology to thinking about this sort of pan-mechanism of parts and larger structures which are machines. So an anarchic ontology perturbs our knowing in advance who and what is capable of participating, counting or acting. And he pushes Rancière's politics in a strange or weird direction. He says, I argue that it follows that all politics is queer politics. Here I return to the original etymology of the term queer, extending its signification beyond the domain of the politics of sexual orientation and gender. Queer refers to the strange, the odd, that which twists and is out of place. Insofar as politics only occurs in those sites where parts contest their status of elements, revealing the volcanic anarchy beneath every system of counting, disclosing the contingency of every object or system's way of counting or producing elements, it follows that all politics is essentially queer. If queer theory initially stumbled upon questions of sexual orientation and gender, then this is because these are mechanisms by which larger scale objects govern parts and constitute elements for themselves, thereby erasing the bubbling chaos upon which they stand. It matters little whether the politics is what we ordinarily refer to as queer politics, whether it is Marxist insurrections of the proletariat as a universal motor of history, whether it be women of colour, or whether it be genuine eco-activists asserting the truth of spotted owls. In all cases, the political moment is the moment where the queer or odd is, as inapparent, appears and challenges systems of constituting elements, governance, and the erasure of parts. So what he's arguing here is that the queer as inapparent, or the real, extends far beyond gender and sexual politics and the politics of identity, to include other sites of political struggle and political praxis which would be non- or anti-identitarian, but which would allow for other parts, cyborgs, whales, computers, women, queers, that compose a larger scale object or machine. So these are all strange strangers which are capable of political struggle or praxis. Now, he follows Jane Bennett in arguing that if we can't know a priori in advance what part can suddenly appear and speak, then there seems to be no reason to restrict the domain of political subjects to the human. Indeed, any part, human or otherwise, can rise up within an assemblage or large-scale object and force its reconfiguration, the disconnection of certain elements and new connections among elements. These moments where non-human agents such as cane toads, natural gas leaks produced through fracking, and hurricanes can rise up and disrupt the orderly auto-reproduction of systems look suspiciously like the agencies of political subjects. So this is a de-anthropocentrization of what Rancière calls the politics of literarity. Man is not just a literary animal for Bryant. Any entity or any body, human, animal, object, machine, discipline, refuses to stay in its place, is anarchic, and is capable of imagining new forms of life, new collectivities, incommensurable and excessive communications, a promiscuous kind of entanglement between anyone and anything, and that's the queerest dimension of politics that we can think of. I want to finish up by talking about what I call that Butler's precarious and troubling politics names one of the many practices by which futurity can be kept alive. The vision of radical democracy and the future to come leads Butler to a crucial commitment, a commitment we offer that she makes as a political theorist, the commitment to a conception of democracy which is futural, which remains unconstrained by teleology, and which is not commensurate with any of its realizations, requires a different demand, one which defers realization permanently. So paradoxically, on this reading of Butler, democracy is secured precisely through a resistance to its own realization. So whatever goals are achieved, democracy itself would remain unachieved. Okay, so the struggle will be always for radical democracy, and this would demand an openness to democracy's future to come, a struggle that must not use theory to constrain or foreclose options in advance. The role of the political theorist must therefore to be joined in this struggle to shape or reshape the political. And elsewhere I've called this openness to democratic futures a universality to come. And we can discern the shape of this political promise in an interview between William Connolly and Butler on the questions of power, politics and ethics. He says there, a given conventional formulation of universality is exclusionary. It acts as if it were universal, but the very limits to universality that it presumes and posits give the lie to its substantive claim. Thus, we might say that the conventional formulation of universality in this instance is a conjecture, takes place in the mode of as if, but proves to be substantially false by virtue of the kinds of positions it fails to include in its purview. It proves to be false substantially by virtue of the kinds of positions it fails to include in its purview. The universality that claims the status of truth turns out to be both conjectural and limited, and so becomes a spectral instance of its own claim. Those who fail to be included by the universal are still subjects, but they exist in a spectral zone, an ontologically suspended zone, to the extent that they lack authorization as human by the conventions of universality that set limits on that term. What proves promising for critique, in the Foucauldian sense, is that depending on the perspective by which this situation is viewed, one of the other terms appears as irreal, and so no stability is achieved. One might say that the very vacillation between spectral attributions, universality is irreal, or the subjects excluded by its terms are irreal, shows the differential distribution of ontologizing effects, and provides a space, an interval, for an intervention that seeks to show the unstable truth at issue in the scene. Now, Levi Bryant's Object Oriented Ontology is also in fidelity to this Butlerian conception of the real. He explains that the real, by contrast, is something entirely different in Lacan. The real, as Lacan repeats endlessly, is not reality, the correlational system and the synthesis of the imaginary and symbolic, but rather is that which is both in excess of all reality and that which evades all reality. The real is that which is without place in reality. It's a strange sort of placelessness. The real, despite being invisible, nonetheless appears. The rest, or the real, is a placeless appearance. The real is a placeless appearance. It is for this reason that Lacan will say that the real is a missed encounter. The imaginary symbolic system that constitutes reality is a system of anticipations in our ongoing dealings with the world. A missed encounter is precisely a contingent encounter that is not pre-delineated in any way by this anticipatory system. It is an appearance of the impossible. The real is the appearance of the inapparent, of the anarchic excess beneath the reality system, of that which has no place. It is the real, not reality, that O aims at. It is the real, not reality, that queer aims at. There is always an excess and inappearance that evades the correlation system of reality, and it's for this reason that objects always harbour, to use Harman's language, a volcanic potential to surprise or to constitute a missed encounter, or an encounter that evades all symbolic or imaginary systems of anticipation. O is a realism of the real and not reality. So the universality to come, it might never appear. It will be chancy, it will be a risk, it will harbour a threat within this promise of the new. And Butler is aware of this. She says the new, a field of possibility, is not the same as an order of possibility. I think that many people recoil from this possibility, fearing that the new, which is not predictable, will lead to a full-scale nihilism. And it is, in a way, a risky moment in politics. What the new form of universality brings will not be necessarily good or desirable, but it is equally true that nothing good or desirable will arrive without it, without the new. So this universality yet to come cannot be just another sovereignty. And Bennett knows this all too well. When she talks about onto-sympathy, she says it can't become an onto-sovereignty. Universality and democracy, the terms themselves are open to reiterability, to recitation, and to a meta-performative letting be or a letting come, a welcome or generous hospitality to that which may come or whoever may arrive. So Butler and Bennett and the Object Oriented Ontologists share this affinity for shaping and reshaping the political and what counts as agency, a mutual sympathy for collective life, attachments and forms of life, aesthetic subjectivities, creaturely entanglements and enmeshments, which need not necessarily be limited to human activities, human capacities or human propensities, because we can't know in advance what these shared modes of attachment or these strange kinships or resonances or dangerous undercurrents. We don't know yet what they will do for political theory or what they will do for object oriented ontology or feminism or queer theory. So the question of ecologies of the present urgently and the question of ecologies of the future no less urgently, I would say, like the problematic of sexual difference that we were talking about yesterday, remain always productively, generatively, promisorially and generously open, but only for those who have an ear to listen for it, and only those who are willing to consent to its call. Okay, so leave it there. Thank you.